The year was 1879, in a remote European village where mist clung to the cobblestones and church bells tolled with deliberate slowness, echoing over rooftops that had seen centuries pass in quiet monotony. On a cold autumn night, a child was born into the modest home of the Weiss family. Her arrival was unremarkable in the eyes of midwives and neighbors alike, yet those who glimpsed her small, pale face whispered that there was something unusual about her gaze, an intensity beyond infancy, a quiet awareness that seemed to pierce the dim candlelight and reach into the minds of those around her. They named her Clara. In the beginning, she appeared like any other child, smiling faintly at her mother, cooing softly when touched, lulled into slumber by the rhythmic rocking of the cradle. Days passed normally, filled with laughter, tears, and the minor trials of childhood. However, on the third night, the first anomaly revealed itself. Clara did not sleep. Her mother, initially unalarmed, assumed it a fleeting restlessness, a normal variation in newborn behavior. Hours stretched into the long quiet of the night, and still the girl remained awake, eyes glimmering in the candlelight, attentive to the faintest sounds from outside the window, as if every whisper carried a message only she could decipher. Morning arrived, bringing no relief, no sign of fatigue, no soft surrender to dreams. Her small chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, her body untroubled by the strain that would have felled any ordinary child. Concern crept into her parents' minds, mingled with a strange sense of wonder. Was this an omen, a blessing, or a portent of misfortune yet unseen? They tried the usual remedies of herbs, lullabies, gentle rocking, and whispered prayers. Each effort was met with serene indifference. As days melted into weeks, Clara's eyes did not close. Her body remained supple, her mind alert, and her awareness grew sharper with each passing hour. Neighbors began to notice. Mothers who brought children to the well whispered anxiously about the girl who never slept. Fathers shook their heads and averted their gaze, reluctant to witness something that defied understanding. Even the village priest, a man of considerable authority and experience, visited under the guise of blessing the child, only to depart pale and silent, muttering words of caution to the family as if fear had rendered him incapable of speech. By her first year, Clara's parents recorded every instance of her wakefulness, meticulously noting the hours that passed without rest, the unwavering clarity in her gaze, and the absence of any sign of bodily distress. They contacted local physicians, men who prided themselves on knowledge of the human form, seeking answers that could explain what seemed impossible. Doctors arrived, instruments in hand, notes ready for recording. They measured temperature, checked reflexes, observed breathing, and watched her responses to gentle stimuli. Their faces, initially composed, gradually revealed confusion, concern, and finally, something bordering on fear. No matter what they did, Clara remained unaffected. She did not collapse. She did not falter. Her mind appeared fully awake, absorbing knowledge with astonishing speed, reacting to questions before they were posed, demonstrating an awareness of her surroundings that unnerved even the most skeptical observers. Within months, word spread beyond the village. Travelers, curious scholars, and even itinerant performers came to witness the child who ignored the natural laws that bound every other human being. Some were fascinated, others fearful, and still others refused entry altogether, claiming that merely seeing her gaze unsettled them, as though she could peer into hidden recesses of the mind and expose truths best left untouched. Clara herself showed no arrogance, no pride, no malice. She was quiet, thoughtful, observing without judgment, moving through her environment with a precision that suggested an innate understanding of the world around her. Her parents, caught between alarm and awe, watched as she interacted with the family dog, attended to household chores that were far beyond the abilities of other children her age, and memorized conversations that took place outside her hearing with perfect accuracy. As she grew, so did the complexity of her abilities. By the age of 3, she could anticipate questions, solve puzzles before they were presented, and recount events that had occurred in neighboring homes without ever having been present. Those who attempted to challenge her with games or learning exercises found themselves confounded, their expectations thwarted by a mind that seemed to operate on a plane inaccessible to ordinary comprehension. Nights remained uninterrupted. Sleep, which claimed every other child, avoided Clara entirely. Her parents tried more extreme remedies, consulting distant healers, reading obscure texts, and performing rituals that had been passed down for generations. Nothing succeeded. By the age of 4, doctors from nearby towns were summoned, bringing with them the latest medical knowledge, instruments, and an air of authority that usually quelled superstition. Yet each man or woman who observed her departed bewildered. Reports were written and rewritten, yet no conclusion could be drawn. Her body remained in perfect health, her brain functioned at extraordinary levels, and her awareness seemed to expand with every hour. Those assigned to monitor her described sensations that went beyond simple observation, a feeling of being watched in return, a sense that every thought was known before it was formed, a perception of events as they unfolded, filtered through a consciousness unlike any they had encountered. By 5, Clara's reputation had become legend. Stories of the girl who never slept were whispered across villages, spreading to nearby towns, and eventually reaching the ears of more prominent physicians and scholars. Some considered her a medical marvel, others a supernatural anomaly, and a few whispered darker possibilities, suggesting that she was cursed, touched by forces beyond comprehension, or perhaps a harbinger of events too terrible to predict. Yet Clara herself remained unaltered by the attention. She played quietly, observed her surroundings, and engaged with those who interacted with her without malice or deceit. Every action, every movement, carried an air of certainty, an assurance that she knew the bounds of possibility and could exist outside them without difficulty. Within the Weiss household, tension and awe coexisted in fragile balance. Parents struggled to protect their child from the prying eyes of strangers while accommodating the growing curiosity of medical authorities. Nights were spent in near vigilance, monitoring her, recording her every movement, and attempting, without success, to coax her into rest. Each attempt at sleep induction, whether through herbal sedatives, mechanical rocking, or soft chanting, proved ineffective. Her eyes remained open, observing, recording, comprehending. As the years passed, Clara began to demonstrate abilities that went beyond even the earliest observations. She anticipated not only questions but entire sequences of events. Conversations whispered outside the home were repeated verbatim. Patterns in daily life were recognized and predicted with flawless accuracy. Physicians, initially confident in their understanding, began to doubt the limits of human biology, acknowledging privately that the child existed in a space where ordinary rules no longer applied. By the age of 6, the village was fully aware of the extraordinary child in the Weiss household. Parents warned children to behave and respect her presence, elders discussed the implications in hushed tones, and travelers left recounting tales of a girl who defied natural law. Priests visited frequently, offering prayers, blessings, and counsel, yet even sacred rites achieved nothing. Some clerics left pale, muttering cryptic warnings to her family, sensing a power or anomaly that lay beyond mortal comprehension. Clara, unaware of the weight of reputation, continued to live with quiet composure, learning, observing, and growing with a keen intelligence and a calm detachment that only intensified the mystery. Her parents, though proud, were increasingly anxious, caught between love for their daughter and fear of what her continued wakefulness might imply. Nights passed in silent observation, shadows stretching long across the floorboards as attendants, physicians, and family watched tirelessly. Every breath, every micro-expression, every subtle movement was recorded, yet the girl remained constant, unwavering, unaffected by time, fatigue, or human expectation. By 7, her abilities had become more pronounced, alarming, and entirely inexplicable. She interacted with her environment in ways that suggested knowledge of events not yet occurred, a perception of thought and intention that transcended normal experience. Scholars, physicians, and curious onlookers arrived from neighboring regions, each hoping to understand, each leaving with unease. Her reputation as a child beyond comprehension had solidified. Within her, there was no arrogance, no deceit, only quiet mastery over her own body and mind, a being who existed simultaneously within the human world and outside it, a living paradox that defied explanation and inspired both wonder and dread. By the age of 8, Clara Weiss had become a subject of fascination and dread far beyond her family's modest household. Scholars, physicians, and wandering clerics all visited, hoping to understand the anomaly that had eluded every established law of nature. Yet no one left with answers, each witness departed unsettled, carrying impressions that blurred the line between reality and inexplicable perception. Clara's mind had matured far beyond her years. She read books with uncanny rapidity, memorized entire passages after a single glance, and articulated concepts that left educated adults bewildered. Conversations she overheard in distant rooms were recounted verbatim, and she could anticipate arguments or instructions before anyone had articulated them. Attendants reported the unsettling sensation of being observed not by her eyes but by her awareness, as though the room itself bent subtly to her perception. Shadows shifted, sounds arrived moments before events, and even natural rhythms, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind through windows, seemed to synchronize with her presence. Fear began to dominate the environment. Nurses hesitated to attend her overnight, clergy left with hurried blessings and hurried steps, and physicians recorded increasingly desperate notes, wondering if the limits of human endurance could explain her continued wakefulness. Yet no weakness appeared. Her body remained perfect, her heart steady, her mind agile. Locals, once merely curious, now whispered in anxious tones about the girl who defied sleep, who seemed to inhabit both their world and another entirely. Tales spread that she could foresee calamities, anticipate private thoughts, and influence those who approached her without intention. Some claimed they had glimpsed her in moonlight, staring silently into the night, eyes reflecting something unworldly, ancient, and unsettling. Superstitions flourished. Parents kept children indoors, muttering prayers whenever Clara's name arose. Merchants avoided her street, whispering that misfortune followed her wakefulness. Even traveling scholars confessed in private letters that they felt a tangible pressure in her presence, a weight of awareness that seemed to bend the fabric of reason itself. The Weiss household, meanwhile, became a nexus of observation. Doctors established schedules to monitor every moment of her life, recording vital signs, behaviors, and cognitive feats with meticulous precision. Yet no measurement explained what was happening. The girl anticipated every experiment, circumvented every attempt to test her limits, and responded to every query before it was formulated. By 9, the phenomenon had grown more pronounced, and subtle transformations in her demeanor began to unsettle even the most rational observers. At times, she would speak in a low, melodic tone about events that had yet to occur, describing interactions that would happen hours later with eerie accuracy. Other instances involved whispered warnings, cryptic advice, or soft observations that seemed irrelevant at the time, only to be revealed later as truths no one else could have known. Nighttime, once merely a period of observation, became a realm of tension. Those assigned to watch her reported sudden chills, feelings of dread, and fleeting shadows at the corners of vision, as though unseen presences moved within the room. Instruments occasionally malfunctioned inexplicably. Candles would flare or extinguish without cause. The very atmosphere seemed to respond to her, shifting subtly in accordance with her attention, her thoughts, or her movements. Observers began to fear more than failure, they feared the unknown capabilities that Clara possessed. Some whispered about possession, others speculated that she had become a vessel for forces beyond mortal comprehension, and a few silently feared she might be a harbinger of calamity. Despite the growing unease, Clara remained composed. She did not display arrogance or malevolence, only an innate serenity that suggested full understanding of both human limitations and her own extraordinary state. By 10, formalized observation intensified. Teams of physicians, scribes, and caretakers rotated in shifts to ensure complete vigilance. Every heartbeat, breath, and expression was recorded with obsessive attention. Yet the more meticulous the records, the more impossible the findings appeared. Her cognitive ability continued to exceed expectations, memory remained flawless, and her perception seemed to penetrate beyond the immediate environment. Observers began documenting dreams and experiences that occurred while she remained awake, vivid visions, sensory anomalies, and instances of premonition that aligned with her awareness. These reports, meticulously recorded, were never fully explained, and those who experienced them often left unsettled. Villagers' fear became palpable. Stories told in hushed voices described her staring into the night, unblinking, her presence felt even through closed doors and shuttered windows. Children refused to play near her, animals reacted nervously in her vicinity, and whispers spoke of curses, divine tests, or unnatural intervention. Even skeptics avoided her, admitting privately that her presence elicited feelings impossible to describe with reason alone. Priests visited repeatedly, attempting prayers, blessings, and protective rites, yet all efforts failed to alter her wakefulness. Some clerics departed pale, muttering warnings to the family, fearful that the child's abilities exceeded the moral or spiritual bounds they understood. By 11, Clara's anomaly had attracted attention from distant regions. Scholars exchanged letters describing her feats, some skeptical, others convinced of the impossibility, and all equally disturbed. Philosophers debated the implications, considering the limits of human knowledge, the potential intersections between biology and metaphysical forces, and the ethical dilemmas of observing a being entirely beyond comprehension. Clara herself continued to live quietly, engaged in study, observation, and contemplation. Yet her awareness of those around her grew sharper. She could anticipate reactions, interpret unspoken intentions, and respond in ways that left adults unnerved. Those who spoke near her often felt their thoughts mirrored, their fears reflected in her calm gaze, and their expectations challenged at every turn. Night after night, she remained awake. The room seemed alive with subtle tension, the walls echoing sounds slightly before they occurred, shadows elongating or shifting unpredictably, and air currents moving as though directed by unseen hands. Attendants and doctors recorded all phenomena meticulously, yet no rational explanation emerged. Scholars visiting to study her reported uncanny sensations, instruments malfunctioning inexplicably, time feeling distorted, and an overwhelming sense of being observed not just by her eyes, but by her presence itself. At 12, Clara's abilities expanded further. She began making soft predictions about daily events, conversations, and outcomes that consistently proved accurate. Observers noted subtle changes in environmental patterns coinciding with her attention. Reports documented disturbances in ambient sounds, fluctuating temperatures, and even slight anomalies in the behavior of animals around the household. These occurrences were never severe, yet combined with her extraordinary awareness, they created an aura of unease, fear, and dark fascination that grew with each passing day. By 13, Clara Weiss had fully entered a state that blended human biology with an eerie, almost supernatural cognition. No observer doubted the reality of her wakefulness, all questioned its implications. The village, once curious, now feared her. Legends began to form, tales blending truth and exaggeration, describing a child who existed outside time, whose gaze revealed hidden intentions, and whose presence influenced events in ways defying reason. Scholars, clergy, and laypeople all contributed to the growing mythos, yet everyone agreed on one point: Clara Weiss was no ordinary girl. Within her home, nights became vigil after vigil. Attendants grew pale, exhausted, and haunted. Dreams recounted visions of Clara awake, staring silently, speaking words of warning or observation that were realized days later. Even the family, bound by love, began to feel awe and dread, caught between pride in their daughter's abilities and fear of forces beyond their understanding. As her 14th year approached, the tension reached a climax. Observers noted subtle signs of anticipation in Clara's movements and gaze. Nights felt heavier, shadows more oppressive, and silence more profound. Every observer understood that something monumental awaited. The child who had defied every law, who had existed without sleep, whose awareness had penetrated every aspect of her environment, was approaching a moment that would define both her life and the legacy of those who had watched her. By 14, Clara Weiss had become the focal point of relentless scrutiny. Physicians, previously confident in their knowledge, now approached her with a mix of reverence and terror. Observation schedules were exhaustive, teams rotated in strict shifts, monitoring every heartbeat, breath, and expression, taking meticulous notes, charts, and sketches. Yet no analysis produced a definitive explanation. Instruments measured perfectly normal vitals, metabolic rates aligned with human standards, but her mind and body refused the natural fatigue that should have claimed her long ago. Nights became increasingly unnerving. Attendants reported phenomena they could neither explain nor ignore: shadows elongating independently of light sources, sudden drafts moving through closed windows, whispers echoing in empty hallways, and faint reflections of movement appearing where none existed. Candles flickered in response to her gaze, extinguished spontaneously, or burned in uneven patterns, prompting murmurs of fear among even the most experienced doctors. Observers confessed to a creeping dread that infiltrated every waking hour. Dreams became tainted with visions of Clara's unwavering eyes, her voice speaking warnings or truths that materialized hours or days later. Some described sensations of being watched in the corners of the room when she remained still, a presence not entirely corporeal yet undeniably perceptible. Attempts to induce sleep became increasingly desperate. Sedatives, herbal mixtures, hypnotic techniques, and religious rituals were applied in combination. Every method failed. Clara remained awake, serene, unaffected, and observing. Her responses to questions became increasingly complex. She could answer inquiries before they were asked, predict sequences of events, and articulate details beyond her personal experience. Each success amplified the unease of those present. Physicians debated the possibility of a neurological anomaly, considering theories of hyperconsciousness, extraordinary memory, or metabolic singularity. Religious authorities whispered of divine trials or curses, some suggesting that the child embodied forces beyond mortal comprehension. Villagers' fear deepened. Children avoided the Weiss household entirely, animals shunned the vicinity, and parents muttered prayers whenever her name was mentioned. Legends arose, a girl untouched by sleep, whose gaze revealed intentions, whose presence influenced events, whose very existence challenged reason. By 15, Clara had become almost otherworldly. She moved silently, observed keenly, and responded with preternatural insight to every interaction. Scholars and clerics alike found themselves unnerved, sensing her perception extended beyond immediate reality. Many refused to approach her closely, fearing the consequences of her awareness. Within the ward, fear and fascination coexisted uneasily. Attendants whispered of sudden drops in temperature around her, inexplicable flickers of light, and the sensation that walls, furniture, and instruments subtly shifted in response to her attention. Journal entries reflected growing psychological strain. Caretakers reported headaches, anxiety, insomnia, and the feeling that they were being silently judged or manipulated. Some refused continued duty, citing moral unease, while others trembled as they documented measurements. Physicians recorded anomalies without understanding them. Blood pressure, respiration, and heart rate remained within normal bounds, yet every cognitive assessment revealed extraordinary intellect, predictive capacity, and emotional acuity. Clara anticipated questions before they were formed, memorized texts in moments, and spoke of events hours before they occurred. Her family, bound by love and exhaustion, struggled to reconcile pride with fear. The girl who had been their child now existed as a phenomenon, bridging human physiology and something darker, unknowable, and entirely beyond comprehension. By 16, Clara's presence began to influence the ward environment more palpably. Observers reported items moving subtly, shadows lingering unnaturally, faint noises of footsteps in empty corridors, and drafts that seemed purposefully directed. Even the architecture of the building seemed to respond, floors creaked before her movement, doors shifted slightly in her path, and light behaved unpredictably in her proximity. Some physicians speculated that her awareness projected onto the environment itself, an effect that bordered on supernatural. By 17, Clara's cognitive and perceptual abilities had reached levels that defied imagination. She could recall every conversation, recognize unspoken intentions, and anticipate human behavior with chilling accuracy. Experiments designed to test her limits failed repeatedly. Attendants and scholars found themselves questioning not only their professional understanding but the very nature of reality. Dreams of observers became vivid, haunting, and prophetic. Some described seeing Clara awake while they slept, conveying knowledge of events beyond normal perception. Others reported feelings of guilt, dread, or revelation upon waking, unable to distinguish between memory and dream. The village remained tense. Rumors of dark powers, curses, and omens intensified. Travelers spoke of her with hushed voices, claiming that merely meeting her gaze caused unease, anxiety, and even physical symptoms, nausea, chills, or sudden disorientation. Parents warned children and neighbors alike, urging avoidance. Those who ignored these warnings sometimes reported inexplicable phenomena in her presence, reinforcing fear and superstition. At 18, Clara's anomaly persisted without decline. Sleep remained absent, yet her body and mind showed no sign of deterioration. Observers marveled, feared, and recoiled in equal measure. Night shifts became a test of endurance for attendants. Some refused, claiming mental strain or moral discomfort. Journals reflected psychological breakdowns, insomnia, hallucinations, anxiety attacks, and persistent dread. Doctors debated the ethical implications of continued observation. Was it humane to monitor a being so clearly beyond their understanding? Could prolonged scrutiny influence her condition or provoke unforeseen consequences? Yet none could remove themselves from the compulsion to study, record, and witness. During this period, Clara began demonstrating abilities that seemed entirely preternatural. She spoke of events hours before they occurred, identified intentions behind private conversations, and offered cryptic insights that often proved accurate. Scholars attempted to rationalize these phenomena using psychological, neurological, or physiological explanations, yet all theories faltered. The combination of intellect, perception, and environmental influence defied conventional knowledge. Shadows, sounds, and air currents within the ward continued to exhibit strange patterns. Instruments occasionally malfunctioned inexplicably. Flickers of light, cold drafts, and subtle shifts in objects heightened the sense of unease. Observers increasingly interpreted these occurrences as evidence of an influence that transcended biology, perhaps a manifestation of consciousness beyond the physical body. By 19, Clara had fully become a figure of both awe and terror. Every movement, gaze, and expression carried significance. Attendants reported feeling judged by her presence, sensing that every thought and action was observed and evaluated. Dreams became increasingly surreal, blending reality with prophetic visions of events yet to unfold. Scholars, clerics, and physicians alike expressed reluctance to interact with her directly, fearing psychological or metaphysical consequences. Within her home, the Weiss family struggled with fear and reverence. They had raised a child who existed beyond sleep, whose presence commanded attention, and whose abilities challenged the very fabric of reason. Pride and love intermingled with dread, creating a tense equilibrium that persisted despite decades of observation. By the 20th year, anticipation of a turning point began to dominate the minds of all who watched. Clara's behavior suggested awareness of an approaching event, though none could predict its nature. Shadows lengthened at night, the atmosphere thickened, and subtle signs, gestures, expressions, and cryptic statements indicated that her final act of wakefulness approached. Observers, exhausted by years of vigilance, understood that the culmination of her extraordinary existence was imminent. The ward was silent yet charged with tension. Each heartbeat, breath, and glance was monitored, every movement recorded with obsessive detail. No instrument, observation, or intervention could alter the inevitability that all present sensed. Something momentous awaited, something that would define Clara Weiss's legacy and leave an indelible mark on human understanding of life, consciousness, and the limits of the human body. By the 20th year of Clara Weiss's existence, the once curious village had transformed into a place of pervasive fear. Every whisper carried her name with trembling reverence. Children were warned never to approach the Weiss household, lest unseen forces entwine themselves with innocence. Merchants avoided the streets nearby, citing misfortune for anyone who lingered. Even seasoned travelers spoke cautiously, describing a presence that seemed to stretch beyond the physical form, a gaze that penetrated thought and lingered long after the observer departed. Within the household, a grim ritual of observation persisted. Physicians, clergy, and attendants rotated in exacting schedules, monitoring her every breath, movement, and subtle expression. Despite decades of meticulous documentation, no explanation had emerged. Clara remained untouched by fatigue, her body pristine, mind acute, and awareness encompassing the entire environment. Her influence was subtle yet undeniable. Candles flickered in response to her gaze, shadows shifted with her attention, instruments occasionally malfunctioned as if her perception extended into physical reality. Observers reported disorientation, nausea, and dread when within her presence. Scholars convened privately, debating moral responsibility and human curiosity. Some argued for cessation of observation, claiming the psychological toll rendered continued scrutiny unethical. Others contended that to abandon study would be to forsake understanding of phenomena that might redefine science, philosophy, and spirituality. Priests performed repeated blessings, invoking rites meant to purify or protect, yet no change occurred. Some left pale, muttering warnings of forces that were neither wholly divine nor entirely malevolent. Others refused further contact, claiming the child's abilities exceeded comprehension. Clara herself remained serene. She spoke rarely, each word precise, deliberate, and imbued with the calm authority that unsettled listeners. At times she whispered predictions or subtle truths, statements that would only be understood in retrospect. Those who heard them often felt a chill, an awareness of knowledge beyond human scope, and a creeping unease that lingered long after her words faded. By 21, subtle changes in her environment began to amplify fear. The household itself seemed to react, floors creaked ahead of her footsteps, objects shifted minutely without touch, drafts moved unpredictably, and shadows appeared to linger longer than reason dictated. Observers reported feelings of being judged, watched, or manipulated, sensations that intensified as the girl's awareness deepened. Dreams became prophetic, recurrent, and often terrifying. Those who slept reported visions of Clara awake, her eyes unblinking, conveying knowledge of events before they transpired. Some experienced vague premonitions of calamity, others nightmares that left lingering dread. No observer could ignore these phenomena, yet none could fully explain them. Villagers, already tense, sensed the shift. Fear escalated into panic. Superstitions flourished, blending truth with rumor. Whispers suggested she could control fate, that misfortune followed her gaze, and that evil or divine judgment rested upon anyone who approached too closely. Parents scolded children, merchants avoided streets, and travelers departed swiftly, all citing the oppressive aura surrounding her home. By 22, Clara's abilities reached levels previously unimagined. She anticipated dialogue before it was spoken, interpreted the unspoken intentions of all who approached, and navigated complex social situations with flawless insight. Instruments continued to display inexplicable behavior, mechanical devices faltered without reason, shadows responded inconsistently to light, and subtle vibrations were detected in rooms where she lingered. Doctors recorded these anomalies meticulously, though explanations remained elusive. Scholarly debate intensified, exploring potential intersections between extraordinary cognition, neurological anomaly, and metaphysical influence. Ethical dilemmas were debated fervently: should the girl be treated as a patient, a subject, or a phenomenon beyond human moral frameworks? Religious leaders remained divided. Some suggested divine trial, others warned of occult forces, while a few professed that the child embodied both judgment and mercy, a living test of mortal comprehension. Clara, for her part, continued without distress. She engaged in observation, study, and quiet reflection, performing small acts that displayed empathy and intelligence, yet every action reinforced the unsettling perception of awareness beyond ordinary life. By 23, the psychological toll on observers was profound. Attendants reported sleeplessness, anxiety, and hallucinations. Scholars described vivid dreams of Clara awake, unblinking, and conveying subtle knowledge that proved accurate upon waking. Clergy admitted fear that proximity to her might influence their own consciousness. Within the village, fear had crystallized into legend. Tales circulated of a girl untouched by sleep, whose gaze revealed hidden intentions, whose presence shifted reality subtly, and whose life was an ongoing enigma beyond comprehension. Parents forbade children from speaking her name, some villagers went so far as to avoid looking toward her home entirely, and travelers passed quickly, murmuring warnings. The Weiss family, exhausted by decades of observation, balanced reverence with apprehension. Love and pride were tempered by dread, as the girl who had been a child now existed as an anomaly defying the boundaries of reason, biology, and morality. Nights were vigil after vigil, marked by instruments, logs, and shadows that seemed alive. Every breath, step, and glance of Clara was recorded, yet understanding remained elusive. Observers felt a presence that went beyond physicality, a silent influence shaping perception, thought, and environment in subtle, disquieting ways. By 24, Clara's behavior suggested awareness of a culminating moment. Gestures, expressions, and subtle patterns hinted at an approaching climax. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, light flickered, instruments displayed anomalies more pronounced than ever. Those assigned to observe her reported profound dread, feeling as if every action and thought was evaluated, judged, and anticipated. Scholars debated with growing urgency, could her continued wakefulness be finite, or was she destined to transcend mortal existence entirely? Priests argued over potential moral consequences, fearing sin or divine punishment should they intervene. Villagers sensed tension without understanding its nature, whispering that a dark night awaited, one that would reveal her true essence. Clara herself maintained serenity. Rarely speaking, she offered cryptic statements of observation and foresight, hints of future events that unsettled even the most rational adults. Her gaze remained unwavering, eyes reflecting an awareness of time, space, and consciousness that stretched beyond ordinary human comprehension. As the weeks progressed, the household became a theater of anticipation. Instruments hummed mysteriously, shadows elongated unpredictably, air seemed charged with subtle currents influenced by her presence. Attendants reported feeling as if the walls themselves responded to her awareness. Nights grew longer, heavier with expectation. Dreams and waking perceptions intertwined. Observers reported hallucinations of Clara awake in multiple locations simultaneously, delivering cryptic warnings, observing events before they occurred, and interacting with reality in ways impossible to rationalize. Panic, respect, and awe fused into a palpable tension that defined the household. The village, though distant, felt the influence indirectly. Animals behaved erratically, whispers filled streets at night, and travelers described oppressive sensations around the Weiss home. By 25, all present understood the inevitability of a defining event. Clara's gaze, her composure, and subtle behaviors signaled that culmination approached. Observers, exhausted by decades of vigilance, recorded every anomaly with obsessive care, aware that the final moments would hold unparalleled significance. Every breath, movement, and subtle gesture was documented, each anomaly noted, each perception of dread or wonder captured. The girl who had never slept, who had observed, anticipated, and influenced her surroundings for decades, was approaching a climactic event that would solidify her place in history, legend, and the study of phenomena beyond human comprehension. The final night arrived with a stillness that suffocated every corner of the Weiss household. Outside, the village lay blanketed in mist, shadows stretching like dark fingers along cobblestone streets, and the faint toll of church bells marked the passage of hours with deliberate solemnity. Inside, Clara Weiss sat upright on her bed, her posture flawless, eyes fixed on the faint light that flickered from the candles lining the room. Attendants, physicians, and clergy had gathered in solemn rotation, their faces pale, their hands trembling, instruments at the ready. Decades of observation, recording, and analysis had led to this singular moment, the culmination of a life lived without sleep, a phenomenon that had defied every law of biology, psychology, and natural understanding. Air in the room seemed to thicken, vibrating subtly, carrying a faint resonance that none could explain. Shadows moved independently of light sources, pooling unnaturally near the walls and floor, sometimes dispersing suddenly, as if aware of her attention. Candles flared, then dimmed, flickering in response to her gaze. The girl who had never slept did not speak, yet the observers felt her awareness pressing into them, measuring thoughts, intentions, and fears. The room was a theater of anticipation. Every breath, every micro-movement, every flicker of shadow was magnified in the charged atmosphere. Her parents stood at a respectful distance, hands clasped, eyes wide with a mixture of pride, fear, and incomprehension. They remembered the long years, nights without rest, and decades of unexplainable phenomena. A strange serenity surrounded her, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. Something beyond understanding was about to unfold. At exactly midnight, Clara's lips parted, her voice low, precise, and calm. "Tonight, I will rest." The statement was simple, final, and absolute, and yet every word reverberated in the minds of all present. Time itself seemed to hesitate. Instruments recorded subtle fluctuations in air pressure, temperature, and ambient vibrations, each anomaly inexplicable. Attendants shivered despite the absence of drafts. Shadows deepened unnaturally, curling toward her presence. Observers reported sensations of being stretched thin across reality, as if consciousness itself was bending in response to her awareness. Clara's eyes scanned the room with detached comprehension. Every gaze, every subtle movement, every unspoken thought was acknowledged. The air thickened further, a quiet pressure pressing against the chest of everyone present, yet no sound disturbed the room. She raised a hand, slow, deliberate, and yet no one could predict the motion. It hovered, as if conducting forces unseen, orchestrating events beyond human perception. Outside the windows, wind began to stir, leaves scraping against shutters. A faint tremor moved through the floors, imperceptible yet recorded by instruments. Even the walls seemed to respond, faint creaks and vibrations echoing in patterns that defied logic. Observers noted sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature near her body, shadows elongating to impossible lengths, and an occasional whisper of sound without source. Attendants trembled as the girl, whose presence had long been unsettling, became almost unearthly. Her parents clasped each other's hands, their hearts pounding. Scholars and clergy held their breaths, instruments trembling under careful scrutiny. Clara's attention shifted subtly from observer to observer, reading thoughts, discerning intentions, measuring emotions. Hours seemed to stretch infinitely. Her chest rose and fell, breathing calm, body flawless, mind active. Instruments recorded perfect physiology, yet every anomaly suggested forces beyond comprehension. Then, at a moment imperceptible in ordinary time, Clara closed her eyes. The room, still thick with anticipation, seemed to exhale. Shadows dispersed slightly, light settled, and yet a residual presence lingered, a weight of consciousness that no one could define. Minutes passed in silence. Then, a subtle motion, almost imperceptible, indicated the cessation of life. Observers hesitated, unsure if the change was natural, metaphysical, or something else entirely. Clara Weiss, the girl who had never slept, lay in a serene state, her body intact, expression peaceful, awareness concluded. Instruments confirmed what none dared hope: heart no longer beating, breath ceased, metabolism still. Autopsy later revealed astonishing details: every organ, every tissue, every neural pathway was entirely normal. No explanation existed for her extraordinary wakefulness or final death. Scholars debated endlessly, attempting to reconcile decades of observation with the enigma presented by her life and passing. Clergy reflected on divine mystery, considering whether human understanding could ever encompass such a phenomenon. The village, upon hearing the news, reacted with a mixture of relief, fear, and reverence. Legends crystallized immediately: a girl untouched by sleep, whose gaze influenced reality, whose mind surpassed comprehension, whose presence tested human understanding, and whose final rest left observers questioning the limits of life itself. Within the Weiss household, attendants recorded vivid accounts of the final night: flickering shadows, chilling air, unexplained vibrations, and sensations of consciousness beyond human scale. Dreams of observers remained haunted for years, recurring visions of Clara awake, communicating cryptic truths, and silently observing events long after her death. Scholars, when revisiting records, acknowledged her case as a testament to both the potential and limitation of human comprehension. Her life challenged assumptions about physiology, psychology, and the intersection between natural law and the unknown. Clara Weiss became emblematic, a figure of endurance, mystery, and the sublime challenge of phenomena beyond ordinary explanation. She entered history as more than a child; she became a symbol of the unknown potentials lurking within human existence. Tales persisted: parents told children of the girl who never slept, villagers whispered of her gaze, and scholars cited her existence in discussions of consciousness, biology, and metaphysical possibility. Instruments, journals, and reports preserved her anomaly, though consensus remained elusive. Her story served as a cautionary exemplar: some phenomena cannot be fully understood, some lives illuminate the limits of knowledge, and some existences leave indelible marks not only on history but on imagination. Generations later, the Weiss household, now silent, carried echoes of her presence: subtle drafts, faint vibrations, shadows lingering, instruments still sensitive to imperceptible forces, and stories told in hushed tones of a girl who defied sleep, time, and understanding itself. Clara's legacy endured, bridging centuries through documentation, oral accounts, and persistent legend. Those who encountered her, or even studied her case, reported recurring impressions of being observed, sensations of awareness beyond explanation, and reflections on limits of comprehension. She became a figure invoked in discussions of impossible phenomena, a cautionary exemplar, and a symbol of humanity's confrontation with the inexplicable. In the end, Clara Weiss did not merely die, she transcended ordinary life, leaving behind a world forever altered in perception, understanding, and imagination. Her existence illuminated the fragile boundary between science, superstition, and the human yearning to comprehend what cannot be measured, named, or contained. The final night concluded, but the shadow of her consciousness lingered, a subtle, persistent reminder that some forces within existence remain beyond control, beyond understanding, and profoundly, permanently mysterious. Years after Clara Weiss's final night, the village remained indelibly marked by her presence, though she had long ceased to walk its streets. The Weiss household, once bustling with observers, physicians, and attendants, stood silent, its shadows heavier than ordinary. Locals whispered that even the walls remembered her gaze, that every floorboard retained the memory of her weightless footsteps, and that flickering lights or sudden drafts hinted at a consciousness lingering beyond mortal departure. Travelers who passed the village reported inexplicable sensations: shivers down the spine, a feeling of being silently evaluated, and fleeting glimpses of movement in peripheral vision. Scholars studying her life compiled meticulous records, journals, sketches, instruments readings, and first-hand accounts. Each document described phenomena that resisted explanation: decades without sleep, extraordinary cognitive abilities, environmental responses to her awareness, and premonitions that manifested with uncanny precision. Ethical debates persisted. Some argued her observation constituted a violation of moral principles, while others contended it was a necessary study of the limits of human understanding. Folklore grew organically, blending fact and imagination. Children were warned not to anger spirits or stare too long at mirrors, lest Clara's gaze return through reflective surfaces. Elders recounted tales of objects moving on their own, shadows dancing unnaturally, and whispers carrying knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. These stories were told not merely as entertainment but as warnings of the thin veil separating ordinary existence from realms beyond understanding. Historians debated the significance of her anomaly. Some framed her as a medical miracle, a case of extreme hyperconsciousness, or a singular neurological phenomenon. Others posited supernatural interpretations, a child touched by divine forces, a vessel for latent cosmic awareness, or an entity bridging mortal and otherworldly perception. Artists and writers found inspiration in her tale. Paintings captured her unblinking eyes, journals reflected her serene composure amidst chaos, and novels echoed the tension and dread experienced by those who observed her life. Across decades, the legacy of Clara Weiss remained unsettlingly alive. Reports persisted of minor anomalies at the Weiss household, shadows that shifted without explanation, candles that flickered unpredictably, and an occasional sensation of presence where none should exist. Residents acknowledged these as remnants of her extraordinary consciousness, evidence that some aspects of her awareness had persisted beyond death. Philosophers pondered the implications. Could consciousness exist independently of physical life? Did Clara's presence indicate a form of awareness beyond the human experience? How should humanity reconcile the tangible, unexplainable phenomena she left behind? Religious authorities revisited their conclusions, some interpreting her life as a divine trial, others as a demonstration of forces neither wholly benevolent nor malevolent. Tales of her wakefulness became a touchstone for discussions on morality, human limits, and the nature of reality. By the turn of the century, Clara Weiss had entered the annals of dark history, a child who defied sleep, whose intellect surpassed comprehension, and whose presence altered the environment itself. Villagers no longer feared her actively, but respect and cautious awe endured. Stories passed through generations, recounted at hearths, in schools, and during gatherings, always accompanied by subtle warnings and reverent tones. The Weiss household became a destination for those seeking to experience echoes of her phenomenon. Scholars and curious travelers alike reported subtle disturbances, air currents behaving unpredictably, faint shadows at the edge of vision, and the persistent impression of being silently observed. Each visitor left with a blend of awe, fear, and contemplation, reaffirming the lasting impact of her extraordinary existence. Instruments that had once recorded her movements and awareness were preserved as relics of impossible phenomena. Future generations of researchers found them puzzling yet illuminating, offering insights into cognition, perception, and the limits of physical law. Some theorized that Clara had achieved a state of consciousness extending beyond the biological, leaving traces detectable by sensitive apparatus long after her death. In literature, Clara became an archetype of human potential intertwined with supernatural influence. Stories emphasized her serenity, intellect, and extraordinary perception, while maintaining the ominous tension that had defined her life. Readers felt the weight of her presence, the unnerving clarity of her gaze, and the subtle power she exerted over the environment. Modern reflections on Clara Weiss considered her life as a cautionary exemplar. Ethical scholars debated the propriety of observation versus intervention, the responsibility of documenting phenomena beyond human comprehension, and the psychological impact on witnesses. Psychologists examined her case as a precedent for extreme cognitive and perceptual abilities, while philosophers explored her implications for consciousness studies. Folklore remained intertwined with fact. Villagers recounted sightings of her shadow at dusk, or faint reflections in windows when no one else was present. Some reported that objects moved subtly as if guided by an unseen hand, and that the atmosphere carried a pressure, barely perceptible, reminiscent of her presence. Over time, Clara Weiss became immortalized not merely as a historical figure but as a symbol of humanity confronting the limits of understanding. Her life and death offered enduring lessons. Some phenomena cannot be contained, comprehended, or rationalized. Human curiosity and observation can illuminate but never fully grasp, and the boundaries between natural law, perception, and the unknown are fragile, shifting, and eternally mysterious. Scholars returning to her case consistently found new anomalies, subtle but consistent evidence that the awareness she had embodied might persist in some form. These observations were recorded meticulously, ensuring that Clara Weiss's legacy continued to challenge and inspire generations. Artists continued to depict her unblinking eyes, her serene posture, and the charged tension of the Weiss household at the height of her anomaly. Novels, essays, and philosophical treatises used her life as a lens through which to examine human consciousness, morality, and the unknowable. Even decades later, the village, though modernized, retained the subtle weight of her story. Residents avoided certain streets at night, passing the Weiss home quickly and in silence. Travelers continued to recount strange impressions, sensations of being evaluated, and fleeting glimpses that could not be explained. Clara's life had left an indelible mark, not merely on those who witnessed it firsthand, but on the collective imagination of a region, and eventually, a world. In closing, Clara Weiss's story endured as the ultimate dark history tale, a girl untouched by sleep, whose awareness transcended physical law, whose presence influenced reality itself, and whose final rest left more questions than answers. Her life challenged every assumption about human limits, morality, and consciousness, ensuring that the legend of the girl who never slept would persist, whispered across generations, a chilling reminder that some mysteries endure eternally, defying comprehension, and haunting the boundaries of history and imagination.